There are wars the Imperium chooses to fight, and then there are wars it is forced to survive. The Fourth Tyrannic War was the latter. It did not begin with banners or proclamations. It began in the silence of extinguished stars, in the sudden absence of astropathic signals from the southern void. Not a declaration of war, but the quiet confirmation that entire sectors had already been devoured. Hive Fleet Leviathan had returned, not as a spear thrust into a single region, but as a vast, branching monstrosity spreading across the galactic south, west, and deeper into the core than ever before. Its previous defeats had only taught it to be faster, hungrier, more cunning. Now it surged in simultaneous vectors, consuming systems before reinforcements could even be dispatched. Planets fell in hours. Moons cracked under the weight of biomass. The void was choked with spores and corpse ships, and Leviathan was learning. Everywhere the Tyranids struck, the same pattern emerged. The Imperium's traditional doctrines failed. Fortress worlds held for days before succumbing. Relief fleets arrived to find nothing left. Coordinated defenses crumbled under the speed and scale of the swarm's pressure. The Tyranids were not just stronger. They were smarter, more dispersed, and utterly relentless. What had worked during the Third Tyrannic War no longer applied. The enemy had changed. And so, for the first time in centuries, the Imperium was forced to change with it. It was not a decision made easily. The Adeptus Administratum resisted. The Militarum hesitated. But the data was irrefutable. If the Imperium continued deploying vast, slow fleets and depending on static planetary defenses, Leviathan would reach the Segmentum Solar before the next Terran year. Something had to be done. Something faster. Something leaner. Something that could bleed the swarm before it reached the next world. And so a new doctrine was born, not in desperation, but in ruthless calculation. One that prioritized speed over strength, autonomy over central command, precision over permanence. Thus were the Solblades commissioned, not rogue fleets, not unsanctioned warbands, but authorized battle groups conceived by the Navy's highest strategic echelons and backed by the full might of the Imperium. Rapid response task forces built to strike first, strike deep, and then vanish before the Tyranids could adapt. Not to hold ground, but to inflict disruption, targeting synapse beasts, digestion nodes, and biofleets before they reached critical mass. They were not designed to reclaim. They were designed to delay. And in the face of annihilation, that was enough. The Solblades were not the hammer of the Emperor. They were the knives. Quiet, fast, and fatal, cutting tendrils off the great beast before they could tighten around the throat of mankind. The Solblades were not a miracle. They were a directive, brought forth by cold Imperial logic, not prophecy, not desperation, but planning. Real, structured, sanctioned planning, forced into existence by data too horrific to ignore. For all its rot and inertia, the Imperium still possessed minds capable of clarity. And when the projections came in, millions of lives per hour lost across dozens of splintering war fronts, those minds did something extraordinary. They acted. The Solblades were born in the halls of the Segmentum Solar High Strategic Command, sanctioned by multiple branches of the Imperial Navy, and blessed, grudgingly, by the Adeptus Ministorum and the Collegia Titanica. They were not formed on a whim. They were assembled with ruthless intent to create a new kind of battle group, fast and self-sufficient, capable of striking behind Tyranid lines and bleeding the Hive before its synaptic momentum became irreversible. Authorization came down in encrypted fragments, orders issued across multiple sectors simultaneously, designations classified, fleet assets reallocated with terrifying speed. Worlds in transit zones saw entire regiments vanish from muster lists, their destinies rewritten in an instant. Mechanicus forge vessels were rerouted without explanation. Astartes strike cruisers were detached from crusades and redeployed under new command structures. Everything moved too fast for resistance. The Solblades had begun. They weren't fleets in the traditional sense. There were no parade formations, no broadcasted deployments. Instead, each Solblade was a composite task force assembled with deliberate variation. Some were built around Astartes-led strike platforms. others around Mechanicus data spearheads or guard-heavy boarding flotillas. The only constant was speed, flexibility, autonomy. Each was empowered to act independently, to strike where needed, when needed, with minimal oversight. This was not heresy. It was policy, approved in silence by those who understood the Tyrannid threat for what it was, a biological superweapon evolving in real time. You could not face such an enemy with slow, procedural deployments. You needed initiative, precision, violence that did not wait for a quorum. And the Solblades delivered. They were deployed to systems already marked for death, worlds on the far edges of defense perimeters, doomed colonies where larger fleets wouldn't arrive in time. There, they struck first, sometimes to save, sometimes to scorch, sometimes to deny biomass to the swarm entirely. Their operations were brutal, efficient, and devoid of ceremony. They weren't rescuers, they were interrupters, scalpel groups that turned Leviathan's momentum into hesitation. The upper echelons of Imperial command praised them, quietly. Dispatches spoke of notable effectiveness, operational disruption, and commendable delay metrics. But beneath the data lay the truth. The Solblades were working. Against all probability, these small battle groups were punching above their weight, not by winning battles, but by preventing them from needing to happen. And with that success came replication. Other sectors adopted the model. Navy groups in Segmentum Tempestus began requesting Solblade structuring. Forge World started building deployment packs tailored to Solblade compatibility. It was no longer an experiment. It was doctrine. The Imperium had adapted. Briefly, barely, but enough. That truth matters, because it means that for all its decay, the Imperium still remembers how to learn when it has no other choice. And for a time, it chose to build something that wasn't designed to endure, but to fight, hard, fast, without hesitation. To understand the Solblades is to understand purpose without excess. These were not grand fleets with banners trailing across the stars. They were functional instruments, precise, flexible, and brutally efficient. The Imperium did not craft them for glory, and that was their strength. Every element served a role. Every ship, every soldier, every right existed to buy seconds from extinction. Nothing more, nothing less. Each Solblade battle group was designed around the principle of strategic autonomy. They operated far from the stabilizing presence of high command, often deep in Tyrannid-held void space, and so they had to be self-sufficient. Each fleet bore the capability not just to fight, but to function independently for extended operations. Targeting, engagement, analysis, and withdrawal, all executed without support. Their backbone was the Imperial Navy, but not in the form of ponderous war fleets. Instead, the Solblades relied on fast cruisers, carrier groups, torpedo destroyers, and void-hardened escort squadrons. These ships didn't engage in fleet-to-fleet combat. They were built to flank digestion fleets, to insert kill teams into bio-vessels, to fire and fade before the swarm could counter-adapt. The Adeptus Astartes played a critical role. Solblade deployments often included company-sized formations drawn from chapters skilled in ship-to-ship boarding and strike operations. These Space Marines weren't there to lead campaigns. They were the scalpel edge, breaching hive ships, assassinating synapse creatures, and detonating spore core clusters from within. Their war was measured in decks cleared, not planets saved. Backing them were Mechanicus assets, often drawn from explorator subfleets or Forge World specialist detachments. Their role was not merely support, but integration. They optimized void pathing, recalibrated noospheric targeting across entire battle groups, reprogrammed Skitarii units mid-deployment. In rare cases, they deployed Questoris-class knights via grav drop directly into Tyrannid seeding zones, where they would hold for minutes, just long enough for the rest of the fleet to finish its work. Alongside these forces moved the Astra Militarum, but not in traditional form. No mass infantry waves or armoured divisions. These were specialist cadres, drop troops, orbital shock forces, hardened veterans pulled from near-dead regiments. They knew how to hold airlocks, breach void-carved hives, and detonate reactor cores behind enemy lines. They were not expected to return. They knew it. And then there were the outliers, the ecclesiarchy missionaries, whose role was not morale, but containment. They sanctified the decks of ships that entered hive flesh. They burned corrupted regiments. They kept the human soul intact where the hive threatened to unmake identity itself. On occasion, sisters of battle accompanied them, not in force, but in purpose. A single squad could maintain spiritual cohesion across a battle group teetering on the edge of annihilation. The genius of the Soulblade was not in any one element. It was in the way those elements were combined. Navy, Guard, Astartes, Mechanicus, Ecclesiarchy, assembled with strategic asymmetry. No two battle groups were the same. Some were blunt force trauma, others were surgical. Each one tailored to the region, the threat, the moment. A living countermeasure against a living weapon. Tyranid biofleets, by their nature, are designed to consume patterns. Predictability is weakness. The Soulblades offered no such pattern. They struck from unexpected vectors, with unfamiliar force compositions, using tactics that were never repeated. Even the hive mind struggled to model them in its psychic echo space. They moved like fractures, unreadable, unstable. The war against the Tyranids has never been measured in victories. Not truly. Every world saved is one more moment before another falls. Every fleet preserved is one more tool before the jaws close again. And in this grim arithmetic, the Soulblades found their purpose, not to win battles, but to delay oblivion. Every operation they conducted, every second they bought, was a calculated defiance against extinction. Tyranid warfare is built on momentum. Once Leviathan takes root, it accelerates, growing, consuming, adapting in geometric scale. Traditional military responses arrive too late, strike too shallow. But the Soulblades moved first. Not to reclaim lost worlds, but to ensure those losses didn't cascade into full sector collapse. They understood the nature of the war. They understood that slowing the swarm was the only way to survive it. Their strikes were chosen with care. Synapse nodes, gestation spheres, feeder fleets. Each operation was calibrated to disrupt rather than destroy. A single dead synapse creature at the right time could delay a hive assault by hours, sometimes days. That was enough. A few more rotations of a planet's orbit. Enough for an evacuation fleet to arrive. Enough for a fortress moon to raise void shields. Enough for another Soulblade to strike somewhere else. Sometimes their mission succeeded. The hive mind would reel. The advance would falter. The swarm would splinter and consume itself. Sometimes they failed. Ambushed, overwhelmed, digested. Their work was not a straight line. It was a battle against time itself. But every second mattered. They became masters of targeted attrition. Instead of fighting entire splinter fleets, they would harass digestion tendrils mid-process. They would force Leviathan to divert resources, overextend itself, burn through stored biomass. Tyranid ships were left starving in orbit, unable to complete their transformation sequences. Seeding spores were neutralized before planetary atmospheres could be corrupted. Planetary death cycles were interrupted halfway through, leaving Leviathan with planets it could not fully consume. Even when they lost, the Soulblades made the enemy work for its victory, and that work slowed everything. But it wasn't just the enemy they bought time for. They bought time for the rest of the Imperium to catch up, time for battle fleets to mobilize, time for forge worlds to shift production, time for planets to fortify, for citizens to flee, for astropaths to scream warnings into the warp. Without Soulblade action, those moments would have been erased. Entire sectors would have gone dark without a whisper. They turned screams into signals. The High Command knew this. They saw it in the data. War zones that should have collapsed in weeks lasted months. Even Leviathan's adaptations began to slow, not because it couldn't overcome the Soulblades, but because it had to allocate effort. That allocation cost it tempo. That tempo was everything. Soulblade captains measured success not in enemies killed, but in moments preserved. They tracked operations by seconds, literally. How long they delayed digestion, how much planetary biomass was denied, how long orbital assault vectors were forced to reconfigure. They catalogued these seconds like saints once counted relics, fragments of holy resistance in a war that offered no salvation. Most will never know who they were. There will be no statues raised for the Solblades, no planetary holidays, no verses added to the Imperial Creed. The names of their captains are lost to dead data looms, their kill counts buried beneath layers of administratum obfuscation. Even the ships themselves, those agile, void black blades of war, were often reassigned, repainted, or left to rot in the void after their task was complete. But what they accomplished remains etched in the war itself, in the unspoken truth that every moment humanity still draws breath in the southern reaches of the galaxy was paid for by fire that no one was ever meant to remember. Their sacrifice was never about recognition. It was always about utility. Every Soulblade was a resource that the Imperium expected to burn. That was understood from the beginning. These were not fleets designed for longevity. They were tools, sharp, efficient, and disposable. The moment they finished their task, their existence became an anomaly, a data fragment best buried for the sake of doctrinal continuity. But even as the institutions of the Imperium erased them, the war remembered. Across the stars, you can still find echoes. A barren moon with old craters carved by orbital strikes no official record mentions. A void hulk drifting with Mechanicus runes etched into its hull, its reactor sealed with golden wax and blood. A shattered Hive ship with blasts scoring inside its core, where no weapon should have reached. These are not legends, these are footprints. And in the hidden corners of the galaxy, those who fought in silence still whisper their designation, Soulblade, not with pride, but with precision. Because they remember what it meant to act with purpose, not for glory, not for reward, but because someone had to slow the end. In some sectors, tacticians still study the Soulblade deployment schema, though they dare not name it. Naval officers run simulations based on anonymized battlegroup patterns that mirror Soulblade doctrine. In the Inquisition, whole cells have begun recovering and restoring their data, not as heresy, but as precedent. Because the truth cannot be suppressed forever. The Hive returns, and someone must know what worked. Their flame has not gone out. It has dispersed into 1,000 silent hands, 1,000 unnamed battle groups who fight with the same urgency, the same clarity, the same refusal to let the void consume everything. If you've come this far with us, if these stories carved something real into your thoughts, then carry that fire. Speak the words, subscribe, share. Make the memory inescapable. Because in the Imperium, most things are forgotten, but fire remembers.